Hello and welcome back to our next session. It brings me incredible joy and excitement to introduce our next two guests, the co-authors of Chasing the Dragon, The Rise of the ESG Law Firm. Paul Clements-Hunt and Professor Paul Watchman have been at the forefront of ESG since its inception. Some call them the godfathers of legal ESG. And once you hear their background and their insights, I think you will see why. If you don't yet follow them on LinkedIn, I suggest you send that request right now. In 2004, Paul Clements-Hunt and his team at the United Nations Environment Program Initiative coined the ESG acronym. The following year, Professor Paul Watchman and his team delivered the Freshfields report, a legal framework for the integration of environmental, social, and governance issues into institutional investment. That report was referenced quite a few times yesterday. Their work and insights into ESG ecosystem is unrivaled. And in this interactive Q&A session, they will discuss where ESG has come from, core concerns for law firm leaders and those working in ESG, and the outlook for ESG across the legal profession. Just as a reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A box. While I have a long list of questions to ask these gentlemen, we also want to hear from you. This is your opportunity. So please join me in welcoming Paul Clements-Hunt, founder, the Blended Capital Group, investment advisor to the UN Joint Sustainable Development Goal Fund of the United Nations, and Professor Paul Watchman, special legal advisor of UNEP Principles of Sustainable Development, of Net Zero Insurance Underwriters Alliance, and senior legal advisor for the UNEP Finance Initiative. Those are mouthfuls. So welcome, gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining us. We're going to jump right in, and I'm going to ask each of you to give a short 3-minute, and I'm going to time you, 3-minute bio on your background and your role in ESG. And we'll start with Paul Clements-Hunt.
Pamela, thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity, and I'll jump straight in with the 3-minute clock on. So look, tabloid journalist out of the UK in the 80s, became obsessed with environment through Antarctica and the interest of big oil. Started a business in Bangkok on the environment and ended up in the UN, most unlikely in 2000. And look, on ESG, there's a lot of complication. We always hear there's a lot of mothers and fathers of success and failures and orphan. But in terms of ESG, very straightforward. A group of UN interns, UN staffers, a small team, went, how do we align the UN's goals with those of the capital markets? 2003, we started the process. We needed 3 things. We needed research, which we got in bucket loads from the sell-side analysts, looking at environmental, occupational health and social issues. Across, we got 1,100 pages of research. We then needed a legal underpinning, which we went to Paul Watchman for. We wanted to say, how do we embed this in fiduciary law, and what is this current status of the law in the 9 major capital markets? So we had our research, we had our legal underpinning, which became the Freshfields report in 2005, and we needed theatre. The theatre was the Secretary General Kofi Annan launching ESG at the New York Stock Exchange in April 2006. At the time, we had 53 institutions with $4 trillion. A footnote, where did ESG come from? Well, it started as GES, Governance, Environmental and Social. It was an effort to distance the investment community and attract the mainstream investment community to the basket of issues. In that SRI was great, but not mainstream. CSR was great, but not about investment fundamentally. So we looked at what was material, what were the material issues in terms of investment. And we looked at governance, environmental, and social. One afternoon, sitting in my office in Geneva, we went, what should this be? It was 2004. We said, governance sounds technological or technical. And business knows about that. What's sexy? Environment sexy? Put that up front. What's difficult? The social dimension of this is really difficult for the investment community. Weld it in the middle so it doesn't get flicked off by sort of Milton Friedman-esque lobbyists. And let's put governance at the end. Sounds good. ESG, easy as 1, 2, 3, is ABC, and we ran with it. We never knew that it would within 15 years be so mainstreamed in terms of investment. Look, from my standpoint, 12 great years in the UN, but wanted to get back to business. So I left the UN voluntarily in 2012, having run a renegade unit for 12 years, and created the Blended Capital Group to focus on mobilizing capital at scale to the last mile. That's why I'm in Africa. We have a great portfolio of companies, and we're having fun. Not a big company, but we're having fun, and I think we're making a difference. ESG is absolutely central to it. Pamela, I'm not sure if that's 3 minutes, but I'll pass over to Paul.
That's perfect. It's your turn, Professor Paul.
Okay, thank you very much. I've had an exceptionally unpredictable life, in the sense that serendipity has played a great part on it. When I was 17, I was playing full-time professional football, and I was still at school. That was a difficult one to balance, but I had no intention of going to university. No one in my family had been to university. I ended up studying law because I had a passion for one of my classmates' older sister, and thought that I might have a chance if I could chum about with him. So I copied his what used to be their UCA application. I got into law school, he didn't, and I didn't see the girl ever again, which was a bitter disappointment to this day. When I went to law school, I was tutored and mentored by someone who was interested in homelessness and welfare law. So I became an expert. I became a lawyer in Glasgow, appropriately enough, but I didn't see myself spending my life in Glasgow Sheriff Court, which might have been in front of me. So I went back to university, and I started to write books and articles on homelessness and welfare benefits, etc., which is a great preparation for being a partner in a magic circle firm. Because, you know, there's two things about me, is that I'm the only Freshfields partner to be in the sports pages of The Guardian, and also to have written books on homelessness. And so it's a different combination. And when Paul came along in 2004 or 5 to have 2005 to have a chat to me about doing this, I had been working in the area, the general area of climate change, business and human rights, etc., which folds out of my interest in human rights and homelessness and rights and poverty, etc. But the interesting thing about this is, for 2 years, my professional support lawyer had said to me, Paul, we should do something on climate change. And I said, go away. I'm not interested. Why would I want to do that? And so eventually, the younger people in the department wore me down and said, turn your attention to this. So we did. And it was just serendipity that I think Paul discovered that I was doing a lot of work in this related areas with the Equator Principle and others. And so we've worked together since then. And our latest project is Riding the Dragon, which we'll tell you about in a moment.
And that is a great lead into my next question, because the two of you collaborated on the research and the writing of the report called Chasing the Dragon, The Rise of the ESG Law Firm, and that was published in early 2021. With the follow-on report being called Riding the Dragon, and that's scheduled for release in 2022. What motivated that work? Paul Clements.
Look, it started in the most unusual of places. It started through work with the UN in South Africa in early COVID, in about March 2020. And it was an effort to raise additional funds for the UN in Southern Africa in terms of the impact of COVID. From that, a global debate dialogue with investors, thought leaders, lawyers was initiated. And the bottom line was, we came down to that the incredibly important role of professional services, not just lawyers, but lawyers, accountants, consultants, credit rating agencies, in controlling the investment chain, right? That's where we started. And Paul then really directed us to say, okay, let's peel back what the legal community, as the first one in that chain, is doing in terms of mobilizing, moving ESG, understanding ESG. And that was the inception point. So it started with the UN. It started because of COVID-19. We had 8 months of dialogue with an incredible group of people. We were hosted by UNCTAD, and it blew up from there. So Chasing the Dragon, I'm going to pass over to Paul, but as we peeled it back, we could not believe the developments underway. We could not believe some of the, should we say, the elaborated marketing, the claims of ESG leadership. And we just thought we're really onto something here. There's massive disruption going on. How is the law really handling this? Over to you, Paul.
Yeah, I think greenwashing is perhaps too strong a term, but I felt at the time that there was a lot of law firms jumping on a bandwagon, and that bandwagon was being jumped on by people who were former tobacco defense litigators who are being retread and passing themselves off as business and human rights lawyers. And that only works if you put the prefix IN before the human, and then you get the right title for them. Anyway, so we decided to drill down, to not take the law firms at their word, but actually to look at what people's experience was, because in their personal profiles, and there can be time lags, but we are talking about looking at it in 2019 to 2020, when ESG had started to gather momentum from 2016. So what we were concerned about was, are lawyers actually selling services that they can deliver? Do they understand the context? Because climate change is difficult. When we talked about earlier, you had people talking about metrics and standards and how it's evolved and how interrelated it is. Because if you look at coal, for example, which might be one of the easier ones, we have to then think about just transition. Because you can't just stop, you can stop burning coal, but you have to do something with the Colombian coal mining towns and villages, which are going to be decimated when they cannot export their coal to other areas. So I think what drove us on that was a suspicion that law firms were starting to do it, but could do better. That's, I think, our mission. It's not to say that somehow law firms have been fraudulent or they're doing anything like that. It's, let's do it right. Let's have fun. Let's make money, and let's make a change. And I think it's very important, because Paul's mentioned this, is the connection between business and ESG. Because without business, we don't have the money to get to net zero. So we have to somehow get that pushed forward. And one of the things I'll end on is just saying, law firms and professional advisors are a vital linchpin in all this. And we always focus on the smallest link in the chain, because that's where we can have most impact.
So let's continue with you, Professor Paul. Tell me about the key findings of that research.
The key findings, I suppose, were that there had been a tsunami of legislation and standards and various other pressures. Litigation had exploded. Climate change litigation, business and human rights litigation, the Nestle litigation in the States, the Shell litigation, BP. So there's this whole raft of things happening externally. And clients are coming to lawyers and saying, our board are concerned. Our investors are concerned about what's happening here. Can you advise us how to look at this and take it forward? So there was an external pressure, if you like, but also there was an internal pressure. Things like the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, harassment and bullying within law firms, changing in culture, unsustainable billable hours. Women, I mean, this is one of my prime concerns in life, is that the gender inequality in law firms is so bad that they are boasting having 20% women partners. And to be quite honest, it's a 50-50 recruitment, and women are falling out unnecessary, and they're often much better than men. There is no firm that I've worked for or been involved with where the women hadn't been the better lawyers by miles. Okay, Paul, over to you.
Pamela, from my standpoint, let me focus on one aspect of this in terms of the findings of the law of the Chasing the Dragon. It goes a little bit beyond it. Look, if we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and you're talking about ESG as a way of thinking, perhaps a tool, a metric for that, there's a massive gap, right? In terms of, let's take a favorite client of the legal fraternity: capital market players, financial institutions, investment houses, insurers, right? If we want to deliver on the SDGs, currently global financial assets are 250 trillion. Current exchange-based assets are 109 trillion. Of that, more than 80%, almost 90% is concentrated in 10 markets, okay? My concern and my focus is, how do we get capital flowing to beyond the G7, the OECD, okay? Because if we don't do that, you can forget the SDGs in the less developed countries and the middle income countries. I see that shift as a massive area for lawyers and the legal fraternity to generate new business in. Why do I see that? Look, we won't get a flow of capital from the OECD into the developing countries unless we manage the risk effectively. One of the ways of doing that is through structured derivatives. Who are deep in structured derivatives in terms of the legal side? It's the legal community. Wherever you unpick the shift of capital to deliver on the SDGs or improve ESG, whether it's climate, whether it's ecosystems destruction, whether it's modern slavery, whether it's supply chains, whether it's the mining value chain, you will have to have lawyers who help us rewire the capital markets, rewire the systems, provide new insurance products, actually provide alternative risk transfer mechanisms, and they're the ones who quite often sign off on these documents. This is potentially the biggest shift in law, I would say, and Paul, I know you agree with me, that we've seen for a century, and it's a massive opportunity. It's not just about the risk. The lawyers who do it and who do it properly as we go to transition, whether it's in climate, whether it's in our broader energy systems, whether it's in terms of rehabilitation of the oceans or the biosphere, there is massive business in this. You can only do it if you have it as a law firm in your DNA, it's in your culture. And as Paul said, it's not about retreading people. And no disrespect, but we looked at 9 different areas where we said, if you want to be a cohesive ESG integrated law firm, you have to do this, okay? And we looked at 55 law firms first time around on Chasing the Dragon. This time it'll be 100 law firms. When what not rating them, we're looking for signals and signposts. And one of the critical things we found was, as Paul said, I mean, lawyers who a couple of months ago were, doing structured derivatives, or they were doing different aspects of the law, suddenly you'd find in their profiles, in their CVs online, a sentence embedded, which was about ESG. I don't think that's good enough, right? Because ESG is a way of thinking. It really requires integrated thinking over a period of time. So that was one of my big takeaways. If you're going to do it as a law firm, whether it's Freshfields or Clifford Chance, or whether it's Minters, or whether it's in Mission Dere, you've got to have it in the DNA. It's got to come from the top, and you've got to see it both as, yes, it is risk mitigation, but it's about new clients, and it's also about retention of the best staff. An incredible opportunity. Do it right, you're on side. Do it wrong, and you'll be left behind. It's a time of disruption.
Yes. So that leads very nicely into my next question is, what surprised you the most as you were doing this research and I don't want to say investigating, looking at those law firms that you were evaluating?
Can I start on this one? I have a new slogan for my birthday t-shirt. It's my birthday very soon. And it's law firms and lawyers. And then it says, talk like Ginsburg, walk like Trump. Now, the reason I say that is that there is a disconnect between what law firms are doing and what they're saying. Because quite frankly, as Paul pointed out, and Alan Joe at Unilever believes this, ESG is the hottest recruitment and retention button that a lot of businesses have at the moment. People are interested, and people coming through now are coming through and saying, I want to work with a firm that's got a purpose, a company that's got a purpose, not just a matter of earning money, because money's important, but what's really important is that you enjoy what you're doing and you feel that you're making a difference. So what I found really interesting was how many examples I could come across of law firms and banks screwing up and on ESG. I'll give you a specific example. Deliveroo IPO. I wrote an article for Responsible Investor about this, which I titled The Worst IPO in the History of the London Stock Exchange. And it had I won't name the banks and lawyers, but anyone who wants them can put it up on the screen, or they can go and check who they are. But the thing is, why didn't you spot the fact the gig economy was going to be really important here? The safety of riders was going to be really important here, and corporate governance. And what that led to was a number of potential investors, such as the, now let me think, Aviva, such as, you know, Aberdeen Standard keeps changing its name these days, Legal and General, etc., saying we're not touching this. And the value of that IPO went down from a valuation by JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs from 8 billion to 5. That was 3 billion because neither the lawyers nor the banks had treated ESG seriously. And this is what I mean. It's a matter of having the expertise and thinking through the consequences and having the courage to talk to your clients, to say, we're going to run into this. And you could go to Boohoo, you could go to BP, you could go to the Shell litigation, you could go to Total. All these companies need to be properly advised, and lawyers have to get, I'm trying to think of the word that's not the Mexican expression for they've got to develop some courage.
Cajones.
Oh, that's.
Pamela, can I come in here with my my biggest surprise? And I guess it's on the positive side of the coin, is that when you come across a law firm which is building it into its DNA, or an individual lawyer, and they get it, and whether that's a general counsel or whether it's, you know, external counsel, good ones are in such a powerful position to affect and drive change. Yes, serve clients. Yes, generate business. But in terms of, I mean, I sort of examples of, you know, I mean, Vanessa Harvard-Williams at Linklaters comes to mind in terms of some of the coverage, and you know, whether that's on the, you know, the EU taxonomy and ESG, or whether it's on the G20 roadmap on sustainable finance. Lawyers like Jerion Urhand at Clifford Chance, and it's not it's really impressive stuff. And you understand very early they've been at it for a while. There's deep thinking going in, and they, as senior partners in law firms, are beginning to flow that through the culture. And it's not easy. It's very hard work. And, you know, it is a very deep well of issues, multiple jurisdictions. Let me take one just very briefly. You know, I'm now based in Nairobi, and one of the issues that we're looking at is that the massive exposure of the mining sector to the fact that the poorest people in the world, in Africa, and the most vulnerable communities, they will be the ones digging out the strategic rare earth and minerals that help us to drive decarbonization in the G7 and G20. That creates a huge supply chain and value chain exposure to major mining players and all the mining service companies who do not get that social part, the social part of ESG right on that. That exposure is phenomenal, and it will come under a forensic searchlight in coming years as we move to decarbonization and we look for the minerals to supply that process in terms of, you know, the strategic minerals. The risk there is so huge, but the opportunity for a law firm that can go to its clients and say, look, we're on top of what is a wicked social problem. We will look down the value chain. We will look down and across the supply chain, and we will begin to dig these issues out. To do that, you have to have creativity and innovation and think in a different, disruptive way. What are those wicked social problems that will cause massive liability, litigation issues, and risk for the world's largest multinationals? Mining's one sector. You can go across a lot of other. So there's real business there. Yeah. I'll leave it at that. Back to Paul.
Paul, can I just come in here, because there's two things I forgot to say, which I think are really important. One is the role of general counsel and in-house lawyers. They have got the ability to change their procurement process, to have things in contract that address both climate change, diversity, inclusion, etc. And I've been really impressed with, I mean, and Paul and I are involved with Lawyers for Net Zero, but I'm really impressed by the fact that general counsel are leading this. And I think also it's worth having a shout out because you had David Alfrey and someone else, Thomas Vollard from Clifford Chance yesterday, and they're doing they've got this global task force, and that's what we look for when we're doing the report. We look to see what internal structures drive it through. And yes, Vanessa Haver-Williams has been at Linklaters a while, and she's doing a fantastic job, and so are some of the others. But what we're looking for is, because this is knocking down the silos, it's actually saying a real estate lawyer has an ESG aspect in green buildings. You've got people in competition. I've been doing a lot of work with the UN and the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, and we're looking at worldwide, is competition law inhibiting us achieving net zero? How could we change that? And what I've found is there are a number of fabulous in-house lawyers and people in the insurance industry, in banks, in chemicals, all over the place, who get it, but they need help. And there are some people in the law firms who are fantastic, but we need that structure. We need your last speakers were just talking about how we do this, how are we going to implement this, and so the movement's there. But the reason I asked the question about sharing is you can share across. As a general counsel, you're not in competition. Lawyers should not be really in competition in this area. And so let's share precedents, let's share process. I'm always here to answer questions, and I mentor many people. And I think it's really important that we drive this through. And Pam, thank you for organising this. This is part of the process.
Well, thank you so much for contributing. And both of you have mentioned this, either the word disruption or the words opportunity, or in your case, Professor, you just talked about having to permeate the culture of a firm. So let me pose this question to you, Paul. What does this movement mean for the legal ecosystem right now?
Is it Paul?
Paul. Okay. Look, I think the challenges are becoming self-evident, but let's push a little bit beyond chasing the dragon, what we're finding with riding the dragon, okay? So what we're seeing also is a process of soft international law, whether that's the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights, whether it's any of the new climate change architecture. I mean, you can pick the issues, I mean, oceans, biodiversity. You're seeing high principles morph into soft law, and then Paul can speak more effectively to this. But I mean, particularly in climate, obviously, clearly a wave of litigation where investors are pulled in, or the major fossil fuel players are pulled in. I would go even further, and people would say, "Well, you're speaking science fiction now." If you look at the work that Professor Sands is doing, and the language being offered to the Treaty of Rome, in and around ecocide, right? I have this image in my head that by 2040, 2050, we could possibly have, and people say, no, that can't possibly happen, but a Nuremberg-style trial for big finance and fossil fuel if they do not change their egregious behaviors. So I'm not talking about the companies who are open and willing to change. I'm talking about those who don't, when we have already 40 to 50 years of evidence on climate or ecosystems. So what's the spectrum? And to answer your question, I think we're seeing soft law morph into defined principles, morph into regulatory and litigative aspects. That's clear. We're seeing, whether it's the EU taxonomy on sustainable finance or the G20 roadmap, which was out last week on sustainable finance, all of these things are coming together, and it's morphing, and it's creating a huge challenge where you really will have to have flexible lawyers and flexible legal companies to understand this in and around and across institutions. Again, a point here in terms of the challenge. Look, the Principles for Responsible Investment, which we launched with Kofi Annan in 2006, is now 4,500 institutions and $120 trillion worth of assets under management. They're not all allocating it to ESG and SDG, but the signal is there. Massive pressure from the investment chain to say, get on top of this stuff now, not in a year's time, and we really need your help. I think those things are driving, I mean, in some parts of the legal fraternity, or almost a desperate chaos to say, how do we get on top of this as quickly as possible, because the issues are so deep. Let's finish on Professor Sands. Imagine it, the CEO of Shell and Total and Exxon and some of the other players, let's say 2042 to be kind. but literally ecocide is embedded in international law, and there is a calling to account, right? We don't want to get there. We almost need a process of transitional justice where we say we understand in terms of different parts of industry and business, we've made mistakes, but let's move through that and let's collaborate as part of SDG 17, find new products, platforms, abilities to flow investment, and let's do it properly. Massive intergenerational change for law, and you've got to be really on top of it and sharp as a firm. And I think last point before we go back to Paul is we need disruptive law firms. We need new law firms. Paul references Wachtel Lipton starting in the 60s on a handshake, not even a partners agreement. I don't think they don't have it. Maybe we're in a position where we will see the emergence of new disruptive law firms like Ben McQuay in Hong Kong, Clientele, and some mainstream ones. That's the scale of the opportunity. Paul?
I'll take a very short period of time, as I know we're getting towards the end. Firstly, the new jurisprudence, the legal principles round about climate change and parent subsidiary responsibility in the Shell case, in the BP cases, etc., that are coming through. We're seeing the judiciary, we're seeing members of the Supreme Court of the UK, in courts in the Netherlands, courts all over Europe, coming to look at the intergenerational aspects of climate change. So they're looking not for damage that's necessarily happening now, but they're looking to the future. And if I could just point out that back in 2004, I wrote something that said that parent companies will be held liable for the misdeeds of their African subsidiaries further down the line. Clients need to bear that in mind. So the Shell case in Nigeria last year, the UK Supreme Court agreed with me that when you're a parent company, you have responsibilities for your subsidiaries, and if you try and shelter behind the corporate or hide behind a corporate veil, they'll pierce it. So we're looking at a whole new development in laws. And Paul was right in saying the UN General Principles of Business and Human Rights looks to be soft law, but it was treated as the standard to which companies should comply in the Shell case. And believe it or not, but I'm willing to run a book that Shell lose and lose and lose, and they keep going it. And I can't understand why, if I was a shareholder or an investor in Shell, I wasn't taking, I call him Big Ben because he's very tall, but the CEO, take him off and tell him his chimes need looked at because the wrong notes are coming out. He's not striking properly. So I think lawyers need to do that with clients now. They need to say, yes, short term we can do this, but long term we lose the war.
So both of you have talked about how this is changing the legal industry, particularly law firms. So describe to me what a law firm 5 years from now is going to look like. A law firm that gets how important ESG is in their advising clients. Paul, let's start with you.
All right, Paul, you go.
All right, okay. Look, our attempt to frame it, we looked at 9 areas ranging from just straight climate, through natural assets, through sustainable finance, the 9 areas you can find in Chasing the Dragon. And our idea was, if you want to be a coherent, integrated law firm, you have to be able to offer services across these 9 areas, that you have the relevant expertise also in terms of different aspects of the law, whether it's mergers and acquisitions, or it's capital markets, or whatever. So it's that crossover. It's that the 9 areas, and can you serve these different these different standard requirements, but also the emergence of new issues. We called it natural assets or natural capital, in terms of things like indigenous ownership of traditional lands. I mean, Paul can speak very forcefully to what happened in Australia in terms of the tragic destruction of the ancient lands there. So it's not just about the obvious. It's about having a legal imagination to see where is that soft law, which are becoming standards. Where is that going? How will that create new areas within and around the law internationally? And it's being able to cover them off. It's about coherence. It's about having clearly the right capabilities inside, the right offering to recruit the very best of talent, which the big players will want to do. And I would also say it relates to SDG 17, which is about partnership and collaboration, right? And it's the point Paul made. It's not just about providing the legal backstop for clients, but in some ways leading them to where the law is going. Paul always says, and he will say it again now, X used to say, a good lawyer tells you where things are now. A really good lawyer is able to project ahead. And I think that's the challenge of the SDGs and ESG as a way of thinking. And I'll leave it at that. But that's, it's the ability to understand where we're heading with this tremendous societal change and challenge. You have to collaborate. What are the new mechanisms? How do you do that as a law firm?
I stole that from John Sherman III, who was John Ruggie's right-hand man and is the General Counsel of Shift, which implements the Ruggie principles. I will just say, law firms, if you ask me what they're going to look like in 5 years' time, I think they'll be hubs. I think that within the centre of a law firm, there won't be all these silos, but there'll be an ESG hub. And in that hub, there'll be economists, there'll be high tech, there'll be consultants who can tell them, actually, when you do an audit, you've never been out of Chancery Lane. So when you do an audit in Africa, it's a little bit different. And these are the sort of, but what strikes me about it is it's not just a legal skill set, it's a more holistic skill set. But if I can take the example of litigation has moved from two parties suing each other in court to class action law firms, to third-party funders. It's just changing entirely. And without the class action law firms, over the years, I think I was a bit sniffy to begin with. I think a lot of city law firms and big law firms tend to be, this is, and then you think about Erin Brockovich, you think about these people who've gone out on a limb and created some equality of arms. Now, if I was general counsel of a very large oil and gas company or a chemical company or even a bank, I would be thinking, I don't want to spend my life in court. I want to do that, but you can do it and do it in a positive way. And I just think that law firms, there will be a disruptive law firm. Slaughter and May were a disruptive law firm. Lee and Day are a disruptive law firm. You can look back. But the other thing you can look at as a lawyer, I'm doing something this week for Scottish lawyers. And I thought Lord Mansfield created commercial law and said the air of England was too pure for a slave to breathe. Lord Macmillan did the snail in the ginger beer bottle, the alleged snail in the ginger beer bottle case, revolutionised the law of tort. And my absolute favourite is Thomas Muir, who was a lawyer slung out of Glasgow Law School. Quite a lot of us sort of got close, but not actually slung out. But he went on to be one of the heroes of representative democracy. And if you've never heard of Muir of Hunters Hill, this is a treat for anyone reading it. There's a book by Murray Armstrong. Buy it now on eBay.
Pamela, can I add a footnote there? Yeah. Which is, I think, look, we're 7.8 billion on the planet now. Let's say we're 10 billion by the end of the century. But between 2050 and the 2200, only Africa is growing. It will contribute 80% of the population of the planet, right? Africa is about 1.4 billion now. Access to justice, digital access to justice, bringing in the communities, the most vulnerable communities, who are, again, they may be digging up the precious minerals to decarbonize the G7, G20 economies. But access to justice, I think, is going to become it's a huge issue, but it will be ongoing. Because if we don't begin to bring, through digital platforms and external funding, access to justice to those communities around the world more effectively, we will not be delivering on sustainability. I don't know if Paul's got a view on that, but access to justice for the most vulnerable will be critical, and that will also change the dime as well. In terms of the ability to there's nowhere to hide now. Digital platforms show everything. I mean, Shell in the Niger Delta, in the Nigerian Delta in the mid-90s. I don't think anyone can hide from anything now when there is an injustice, and that will be another major factor. You, Paul?
Well, I was going to say, access to justice is a keystone of the rule of law, and the rule of law is a keystone of a civilized community and country. And so I truly believe in the rule of law, and I think it's very important that lawyers do. But it is going to be, as Paul said, the whole thing about getting data, traveling information across, there is no hiding place. So when you actually dump, as they have in Britain, they've just brought in a law today, or not brought in a law, but they're going to bring in a law to stop the British water companies or the English water companies pumping raw sewage into our rivers. And you think, what century are we living in? You know, really? We do that sort of thing? And people then go into the water, drink the water? And the whole thing about it is the E, S, and G are such integral parts, because the environmental, the Rio Tinto case is a really good case because they destroyed Aboriginal sites. So this was a cultural devastation, but also the human rights of the Aborigines to get out minerals that we really shouldn't be doing, that sort of thing. And poor Rio Tinto will find that, yes, you may not lose your investors now, but there'll be a shareholder action, as there was last year with ExxonMobil and with Chevron. And these people are organizing around it. And they're not organizing it because they want to necessarily be good, do good. They're doing it because they realize that the financial viability of that company depends on their reputation, and their reputation depends on what they're doing. And that is really, really important. I should stop there.
Okay, so I have one more question, and I'll let you answer it first, Paul, because I know you have to run exactly at the top of the hour. So if you have to drop off to catch your flight, I can continue just for a few more minutes with Professor, okay?
You know, I'm going to take a
chance.
I can't resist staying with you for a few more minutes. So yeah, if I go after 5, I'm just have to run faster. Go on, I'm enjoying this.
So this question was private messaged to me in the chat. What would you say to someone, and I'm assuming this is a young associate, asking what can I say to my managing partner to get him or her on board with how important ESG is? Because I think the young people get it. It's power group running law firms right now that unfortunately might not be getting it.
The facetious answer is, senior partner, there's $120 trillion and almost 5,000 institutional investors backing the principles of responsible investment, which are underpinned by ESG. If you don't see business there, and you don't see it now and quickly, you never will. You have to target that. There's a massive mound of investment shifting into the space. Lawyers must love that. There's new business. If I was a young, so look, one point there is I advised a thesis student who chose ESG as her thesis, a law conversion student. The amount of interest that she generated off the back, she chose ESG as a thesis, and the recruitment piece is just huge. So yeah, massive amount of business. Get the best talent. You've got to go that route. I'll leave it at that. Paul, over to you.
I have paid interns. I don't do voluntary internship, but they come to do ESG with me because they then get to help me on work for the UN or work for a major law firm. Because one of the things that I do is I provide advice to law firms about how they should be looking at problems and how they should be structuring problems. And can I just say, one of the firms I do, and you'll see from my LinkedIn thing, which some people think is the signs of incipient madness, but you'll see that occasionally I cross swords with Clifford Chan's senior partner, Jerome. And every time I speak to him, when we arrange Zooms like this, he has David Alfrey in the background. And David's, 3 years qualified, I think. And that's great. And what you should be doing as a young lawyer is to say, look, this is not just a matter of us wanting to do ESG. This is where your clients are. I was told a story by a firm, let's just call them Slaughter and May to keep them confidential. But I was told this story about by someone at a Magic Circle law firm, which may or may not have been. But the story was one of the top corporate partners went to his top client, and his top client was a financial institution, major financial institution. The board only asked questions about ESG. He couldn't answer one. He never wanted to be in that position again. And that's where law firms are going, because if you cannot give your clients good advice around ESG, whether it's accountants like KPMG or it's firms like, I'll just pick one at random, let me pick, well, a law firm, they will move. They will move because what you're doing is you're letting them down, and you have to challenge. And the idea that I have is that law firms should be leaders and lawyers should be leaders. None of us went to law school, did we, just to build out our bank balance? We went because justice was important, that equality was important, that the rights of women, the rights of gay people, everything, that get that fire back and go to your partner and say, look, if Watchman can do it, so could I.
And on that, Paul, you called it earlier, because this is very much a UN term, societal's wicked problems, right? And if the lawyers aren't at the lead solving some of these challenges, who is? And so we will leave it at that. Thanks to both of you so much for your insights. They've been incredibly valuable. For the rest of you, and Paul, I know you have to run, but Professor Paul, I hope you can stay with us.
Yeah.
Our next session will begin at 30 minutes past the hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pam. Great privilege to be involved.
Yeah, Pam, and if anyone wants to contact me and take things further, please just send me something on LinkedIn.
Thank you.
Sorry.